when some of us were defending both qualitative research and postmodernism from the positivist police, much mainstream qualitative research tightened up whatever had loosened up. Education had become a science during that decade, and the insistence that educational research be scientific so we could determine what worked in schools had reduced too much qualitative research to method and low-level technique and process that produced too much pedestrian, insignificant work. For example, data analysis, which Cavalli and Brinkman described as a theoretically informed reading, had been reduced to the mindless coding of data. But then that's not surprising, since it's much easier to write a chapter in a textbook or teach a class about coding data than about thinking with theory, as Alicia Jackson and Lisa Matzey explained in their lovely book, Thinking with Theory. To think with theory, one must first read theory, but I've learned that people do qualitative studies without reading much theory at all. As Patty Lather noted some time ago, methodology often diverts attention from more fundamental issues of epistemology. Ignoring epistemology and ontology in favor of a brute methodology was common in the new phenomenon called mixed methods that appeared in the decade of scientifically based research. Mixed methods allowed some educational researchers to sneak a small qualitative component, maybe a few interviews, into a big quantitative study to get federal funding from Grover Whitehurst Institute of Education Sciences. Confusion and contradiction is not uncommon in mixed methods. For example, when a researcher claims to believe at the same time in the same study that reality is out there to be found and that it's socially constructed. What struck me most upon my return to qualitative methodology after years of defending it was that it had not only retained but had strengthened, again at the same time and seemingly without conflict, both its positivist and phenomenological roots. Of course, post-structural theories critique both logical positivism and phenomenology, humanist projects that are very different from each other. But the theoretical confusion of the stripped-down, scientized qualitative methodology was so readily apparent that it no longer made any sense at all to me, and I began to signal my concerns and my desire for something different using that phrase, post-qualitative research. I also listened carefully to my doctoral students. During the 18 years that I taught our introductory course in qualitative research, teaching it straight, not confusing my students with post-structural theory, I also developed what I called a set of theory courses I would have liked as a doctoral student. I taught a survey course called Theoretical Frameworks for Doctoral Studies, courses on postmodern theory, on Foucault, on Derrida. What happened is that students who took those courses were confused when they moved through our qualitative research course sequence. Their distress became acute when they had to write their dissertation proposals. And they'd show up in my office with very smart questions about how to think the qualitative methodology they were studying with the post-structural theories they'd read. Of course, they were experiencing the same problems I had as a doctoral student who'd studied qualitative methodology and post-structural theory simultaneously but separately. I had encountered the contradiction as I wrote my dissertation. They identified it much earlier. It was post-structural critiques of humanist epistemology and ontology, of conventional qualitative methodology, of language, of the subject, of voice, of data, of representation, and so on, that turned these students away from humanist interviewing and observation, from positivist descriptions of what counts as data, from coding data, from simple thematic analyses, from grounded theory, and so on. Quite a few decided not to take any more qualitative methodology courses and not to do qualitative dissertations. In response, I developed a new course called Postmodern Qualitative Research to support them. Over the years, my students and I have searched for qualitative studies to which we might apply the label postmodern qualitative research, but we found few, if any. A qualitative researcher might claim, for example, that he was using Foucault's theory of discourse analysis to analyze interview data, But Foucault made it very clear in the Archaeology of Knowledge that he was not studying the speaking subject. Foucault examined discursive statements, but not sentences, such as those spoken in interviews. We also found, for example, studies that plucked one concept, like the rhizome, from Deleuze and Guattari's dense assemblage of concepts and used it without understanding their transcendental empiricism, without understanding that the rhizome brings Deleuze and Guattari's entire ontology along with it. Of course, Deleuze and Guattari's concepts are so immediately useful that it's easy to do that. I've done it myself, but it's quite dangerous. In other cases, we found studies that claimed to use post-structural theories of the subject, but included what's called a subjectivity statement, in which the researcher described himself as a humanist subject. We found studies that described post-structural theories of language in the literature review, but then in the methodology section, described data analysis as coding, which assumes that words can be root data like numbers. But this kind of disconnect between theory and methodology was common. We found that researchers often describe post-structural theory in their literature reviews and then abandon it when they get to methodology. Without a pause, they switch to conventional humanist qualitative methodology, to the qualitative methodology process. In other words, their epistemology and ontology are not aligned with their methodology. The upshot of our review of studies that might be labeled postmodern qualitative research is that such a construction is likely impossible. Conventional humanist qualitative methodology is, after all, humanist. How can it also be postmodern? At some point, I began to advise students who were trying so hard to reconcile post-structural theory and qualitative methodology to just refuse that methodology, to give it up, to try to unlearn it, forget it, get it out of their minds. It had become so constraining and limiting and oppressive that it was shutting them down. I do believe that qualitative methodology has in too many instances become totalizing. And here's a good example of that. In a paper I presented at the Illinois Qualitative Research Conference last May, I expressed some of the same concerns about qualitative methodology that I've discussed today. I also described what I just told you about talking with students about their difficulties in thinking post-structural theory and humanist qualitative methodology together. After my presentation, a senior qualitative methodology in the audience, for whom I had the greatest respect, asked me if indeed I hadn't done a qualitative study with my students. She said, you identified a problem, you interviewed your students, and you analyzed that data. Didn't you do a qualitative study? Of course, I can never think of the right thing to say at a moment like that.